I'd like to echo what Brian said. Thank you to the Adam Smith Centre and the Stanford Club and SMU for inviting me and making it possible for me to speak to you this evening. I only have 30 minutes to tell you something which might take 3 hours, so I'm going to be fairly short in some of my comments. But we're dealing here with, I think, with a very important topic which has become increasingly talked about. That is the fact that there are divisions in society, there are conflicts between different groups, and the language of class is used to try and explain what is happening, to see who is benefiting from certain actions and who is losing from certain actions, and trying to explain what's going on in the world using class terms. Now, there's been a long tradition within Marxist and socialist thinkers of talking about class, going back to the French socialists of the 1830s and 40s and Karl Marx in the 1840s. And this language of class from the socialist perspective has become much more common today with the rise of politicians like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders in the United States through the Democratic Party, and of course with Jeremy Corbyn in the UK and the Labour Party. But I would argue that I would agree with them on the grounds that talking about class is extremely useful in order to identify particular groups in society who are losing out or benefiting from particular activities, who pays, who benefits from certain distributions or certain transfers of wealth. But the concept of class is only a valid one if the underlying economic theory upon which the idea of class is based is a correct one. And I would like to argue that the Marxists are completely wrong in many of their economic theories, and hence their idea of class based upon their economic theories is also wrong, and hence their understanding of conflicts and divisions that exist in society today are also wrong. And I would replace that with a much longer tradition, which is a classical liberal one, not a socialist one, of thinking about how society is divided into contending classes. And if you look at the cartoon that I have here, this is from 1815. It shows, I think quite clearly, a classical liberal view of class, which is you have John Bull here, who is the average English taxpayer, consumer, who is suffering this crushing burden, which is weighing upon his shoulders, much like Atlas. And that is the crown, the aristocracy, and the military establishment. And he, John Bull, is the taxpayer who is subsidizing these upper classes, literally here, the upper classes. And this way of thinking about class is one that I would suggest is worthwhile for you to examine. And you will have the aid of a book I recently published called Social Class and State Power, exploring an alternative radical tradition, which is the classical liberal one of thinking about class. And this tradition goes back to the 16th and 17th centuries and is a very rich and interesting one. And this anthology attempts to try and show you or give you examples of some of the ways in which these early classical liberal thinkers thought about class. Now, we have a problem with definition, especially with the term liberal. I won't have time here tonight to talk to you about all the differences in meaning of these terms. When I say liberal, I mean in the classical liberal tradition of the 18th and 19th century. The word liberal did not really appear as a concept or as a word until the early 19th century. Another synonym for classical liberalism might be libertarianism. I do not use the term liberal in the sense of the American version of liberalism, which I would call a form of social democracy or laborism, if you understand English politics. Because of the problems with the term liberal, Steve Davies, who's here tonight and who'll be speaking later in the week, thinks we should reject the concept of liberal and use the term individualism. But I'll leave him to defend that rather outrageous statement in the question and answer period. So what I would argue in this book and elsewhere is that the classical liberal tradition provides a much more correct theory of how we can understand how economies work, how individuals behave, and the theory of class, which is based upon this more correct understanding of economic activity, I think is a correct one. And it is also the only and best way for us to understand some of the conflicts and divisions which afflict our societies today. So that is my claim, and I won't have time really to go into much detail tonight, perhaps more in the question and answer period. Also, by way of prefacing my remarks, I want to just suggest to you that there's another way we can think about the political spectrum. Typically, the political spectrum is seen as left, meaning socialism or communism, and right, meaning fascism, and sometimes also conservatism or free market thinking. And I think that that is a very confused and unhelpful way in which to draw a spectrum to show the full difference between political traditions. So I would suggest to you that a much more interesting and important, a more correct way of looking at it is, on the left we have total political power and control of everything, communism. At the far end, on the right, we have liberty, a completely voluntary state, where there are free markets and voluntary transactions of all kinds. And in between, we have the spectrum of going from left to right of decreasing state power, total power under communism, very great power under fascism. In the middle, the welfare state, and mercantilism, and then what you might call the classical liberal notion of the minimal state or limited government. And then right at the end here, the fully voluntarist state, which according to some theorists like Murray Rothbard, is a form of anarcho-capitalism. So that's how I see the political spectrum, not as left meaning communism and right meaning fascism. Here, communism and fascism are close relatives because of the degree to which state power intervenes in the economy. Now, within the liberal, classical liberal notion of the state, there is also diverging opinions. It's not a single perspective. Again, I have, going from a slightly larger state, the classical liberal state, which argued that the state should only provide defence, police, public goods, and those individuals, the major thinkers in that tradition, are Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and Friedrich Hayek. Then we have a minarchist state, defence, police, but no other public goods. These can all be provided voluntarily on the free market, and that would include people like Ludwig von Mises, Ayn Rand, and Robert Nozick. And then right at the other end, we have the fully privatised state, where even police and defence is provided voluntarily and on the free market. And individuals who argued for that perspective were Herbert Spencer, the younger Gustave de Molinari, and Murray Rothbard in the late 20th and early 21st century. So that's just a sort of something to think about as I talk about the rest of my comments tonight. Here's a list of problems that are caused when governments intervene in the economy. And this is true for communist states, fascist states, welfare states, and even liberal states with limited government. What differs is the degree to which these problems occur. So I can't go into any great detail, but things like information about the scarcity of goods and services are blocked. And according to Hayek, this information about scarcity of goods and services is indicated through the free market pricing system. Rare things have a higher price, things that are in larger supply have a lower price. And producers have to know this information, otherwise they can't produce the right amount of material. Allocation of resources to the most needed end use is hampered. Incentives to work and save are restricted or blocked. The needs of consumers are no longer the prime importance, but producers or the state becomes the prime candidate. There are unintended consequences of government intervention. Markets are forced underground if they're banned or very rigorously regulated. There's the danger of politicians and regulators pursuing their own interests. This is the public choice school of economics, which has developed this in considerable detail. And then the protection of property rights through contracts and the rule of law. Now, when these problems caused by intervention occur, say, under communism, where the government is completely intrusive in the lives and activities of consumers and individuals, these problems are catastrophic, as we saw in the 20th century. Entire economies eventually collapse and millions of people are killed in trying to make this system work. In less regulated and with less intervention, say for example in the welfare state, these problems are very, very serious, although the economies continue to function for decades, although there are serious problems with excessive government expenditure, government spending deficits, sclerotic labour markets, problems of incentive and so on. And even in limited governments, liberal states, these problems can be serious but not catastrophic. So there's a link between the amount of intervention in the economy and the number of problems that arise because of those interventions. And these sorts of interventions are what causes, or I think give rise to, the divisions and the class conflict that I'll be giving some specific examples of in a moment. If you want to read more about some of the thoughts I'll be presenting tonight, please go to my website, davidmhart.com/liberty, where many, the book and many other resources are available for you to read at your own leisure. Here are some more images of, I'm very interested in the connection between art and political thought, and this comes from my collection, which you can see on my website. A larger shot of dear old suffering John Bull supporting the establishment. Here's another one. John Bull, the typical English taxpayer, is Gulliver from Gulliver's Travels, and he's been tied down by all the Lilliputians who are now ransacking, rifling through all his pockets. And these are lawyers and government officials and the church and various vested interests, and they're all rifling through his pockets and stealing his coins. And then, of course, if you have read Iron Randall, this is a poster from the film version of Atlas Shrugged, and again you can see something similar to John Bull holding up the political establishment on his shoulders. So the examples I'd like to bring to your attention where we can apply some of these classical liberal notions of class to trying to understand and perhaps solve some of the very great problems we can see in the world around us. These are just a summary. So we see different groups fighting over control of limited resources in the form of, say, taxes or resources the government has. These are limited. Different groups want to use them for their own purposes and needs, and they struggle and fight over them. And then you have the taxpayers who are trying to minimise the amount of taxes that are being taken from them in order to satisfy the needs of these vested interests. And in the modern state, this is one of the most serious forms of division and conflict in society. Different groups try to get laws passed by the government to further their own vision of the good society, whatever that might be. It might be political, it might be religious, it might be ecological, and to exclude or harm groups they oppose. So they're using the government as a weapon in this war to create what they think of as the ideal society. And if you don't agree with them, too bad. You get regulated, you get taxed, you get expelled from the society in some cases. A third factor, or a third set of examples, are different regions of nation states try to free themselves from central control and taxation and seek autonomy. Right? And there are many examples of this around the world at the moment. For example, in Barcelona, and trying to seek independence from Spain. But that's just one of many, many. Number 4, groups which oppose the capitalist system, which is the free market and a liberal society, and they might seek to overthrow it or to radically change it so it conforms to their ideas of how a future society should be structured and run. And the Greens are a very good example of this at the moment. The Green New Deal in America is, I think, a new and radical form of or attempt to try to bring back a kind of central planning, communist central planning, in order to make sure that the economy follows the guidelines of energy policy and so on. And this requires regulation of every aspect of society in order to be implemented. Then another example here is the most powerful groups in society sometimes wish to use the power of the state to pursue their own interests on an international level. And this might be a way in which we could explain some of the extremely lengthy wars that the United States has been fighting in the Middle East for nearly 20 years. So these are some examples of sort of general groupings of kinds of dissent and conflict which is going on in the world. And I want to talk, in the time that I have left, some examples of this, some specific examples. And this is something that, if you find one of these particularly interesting, perhaps you'll ask a question in the Q&A period at the end. So here we have a large number of examples under this general category. Fighting over limited tax resources. Right? The government does not produce wealth itself. It has to get wealth from other people. It does this through taxation. It then is under pressure to distribute these taxes according to a certain set of criteria. How does it allocate what money goes to what groups? Well, in many cases, it's the groups that make the loudest noise, who have the most number of friends in high places, groups who vote in a particular way and get governments elected. And those governments then reward their constituencies with benefits. So we have examples of this in the opposition, in the battle over austerity. This is cuts to government expenditure. So the people who want to continue to get government benefits, either those benefits to continue or to be increased, those who have to pay the taxes to supply those people and those groups with these services and benefits resent having to pay more taxes. And so you have this inbuilt clash between those who pay the taxes and those who receive the benefits of the tax money. And this in modern democracies, I would say, is unsolvable. This is sort of like a built-in constant source of conflict and division. Another example is the resistance of retirees, let's say in America, to cuts in Social Security and Medicare. Right? They say, well, the argument is that we've paid taxes, all these Social Security taxes all these years, we want to get some of it back. Unfortunately, they're misguided. The money was never put into a fund. It was always being used to fund other government activities. And so Social Security benefits have to be paid by future taxpayers. Again, you have this conflict between young people today who may not ever get any Social Security taxes, but who will be taxed and have to pay for their parents and grandparents to get their Social Security benefits. Again, another built-in antagonism. Opposition to globalization by inhabitants of declining regions. You have examples of this, for example, very clearly in England, which we saw in the last election. Parts of northern England which are suffering economic and industrial decline, resenting that fact and wanting Westminster to continue to fund the industries that they've had for decades, or to find alternative kinds of employment opportunities. And they think that Westminster is not listening to them, and so they vote for Brexit. Steve Davies will be talking about that later in the week, so I defer to him on that topic as well. We also have the problem of protectionism. This was extremely important in the United States with Donald Trump, overturning decades of movement towards freer and freer trade and bringing back protectionism as one of the core policies of his regime. And again, this divides the country into two. You have particular industries who benefit from having foreign imports heavily taxed with tariffs, therefore being uncompetitive in the American market. They can then make greater sales at higher prices within the American market. But the other American companies who use imports as raw materials for the things that they produce, or the consumers of those foreign goods, are the ones who have to pay these higher prices. And so you have divisions and conflict between those who pay or suffer from higher prices caused by tariffs and those who benefit from protectionism. And one of the big ones that sort of has been around for the past 10 years is the argument or the idea that governments are serving the interests of big business, big banks, big investment firms who got bailed out during the financial crash 10 years ago and got all sorts of very cheap loans or got taken over by the government, like General Motors, at very favourable rates, versus ordinary people, shopkeepers and business people who have not been given government handouts. And again, it's the government that is the source of this conflict. So that's the first of the categories. Second one is legislation to privilege one way of life over another. So the movement for gay rights, for example, or genocide in Burma. I just plucked those from Google Images at random, but there's so many other examples you could find. So different groups try to get laws passed by the government to further their own vision of what a good society is. So quite many religious people in America think that just the mere presence of gays in society is harmful and they should be suppressed. They should not be given any rights for marriage or being next of kin for someone who's ill in a hospital or whatever, similar sorts of things. The use of drugs, religious and ethnic minorities who are seen to be somehow preventing a nation from expressing itself as it should as a nation, because there are these other elements that are not part of the nation who are claiming recognition. Pornography, producers and consumers of pornography versus those who argue that this should be banned and people who use it punished. And we have gun manufacturers and owners. So these are some examples of people who try to get laws passed to try to prevent people they don't approve of or like, or who consume or do things they don't like, to have them banned or punished or driven out of society. And this again causes all sorts of conflicts, because many of these people say, why am I being mistreated? Why am I being dealt with in this unequal fashion? And what we've seen in recent years in America is the way in which people have gradually come to accept the fact that gays should have civil rights and gays should be allowed to marry and other things like that. The third group that I've identified is the struggle for regional autonomy. Again, the struggle here is between centralised political power, which wants to have all power in its own hands, and very little or no autonomous power in the regions. But people resent that because perhaps they have a history of autonomy that goes back centuries. I'm thinking of Catalonia in Spain, and they're arguing now, Catalonia used to be an independent kingdom in the Middle Ages. We are a prosperous part of Spain and pay more in taxes to Madrid than we get back in services. The money is going to other parts of Spain which are less productive, sort of almost parasitical, and there is resentment between the periphery and the centre. We also, often language is the issue here, the compulsory teaching of the national language over the regional language. And so another example there is the Basques in northern Spain and southwestern France and perhaps Hong Kong. And then you have regions with very different histories and customs, again, like Barcelona, Scotland, Lombardy, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And as long as the central state wants to impose order and unity upon the regions, you're going to have these constant struggles, these divisions and fighting until some kind of resolution is achieved. My fourth group is people who do seek power to overthrow the system. This is a kind of existential threat in many cases. The revival of Marxism and democratic socialism in Western Europe and the United States is, I think, a serious worry, because in many cases what they want to do is to radically change the nature of liberal society, representative democracy, the free market, property rights. And if they get into power, if Jeremy Corbyn got into power, he was acknowledged the fact that he was a Marxist. Who knows what he might have tried to do had he got into power in Westminster. And the Greens and the anti-climate change movement wish to drastically regulate and control the economy in order to transform energy production and use. There are some people who argue that this is such a serious problem that democracy must be suspended until the climate change problem can be solved. This is a very serious threat to liberal societies. My fifth example, or set of conflicts and tensions, which I want to bring to your attention, is that sometimes there is a group of people called the establishment, called the deep state. A number of terms have been used recently Back in the 50s and 60s, President Eisenhower talked about the military-industrial complex. Many people will talk about the World Bank and International Monetary Fund as international organisations which take decision-making out of the hands of ordinary citizens and some of the smaller countries to achieve other sorts of purposes for other groups of people, for the benefit of other groups of people. And some of the examples I have here, after the terrorist attack in the United States in 2001, there was an exaggerated fear of the threat of terrorism, and enormous powers were assumed by the surveillance agencies, the police, the military, and Congress to try to centralise and increase government power at the expense of ordinary citizens. And this was done under the threat of further terrorist attack. But actuarial studies have constantly shown that the threat of a terrorist attack and the death from that terrorist attack is far, far less than anything like being struck by a bolt of lightning or having a fatal accident driving to the airport. But people don't want to think about comparing risk in this fashion. Using the military to intervene in the affairs of other countries which pose no real or direct threat to the lives, liberty or property of the citizens. I would say that in the example of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya and Syria, they were invaded for other reasons than to defend the citizens of Indianapolis, Indiana, where I used to live. They were no threat to Indianans at all. But those wars have been fought for 20 years for the benefit of certain other groups of people, not least of which are the politicians as well as the arms manufacturers who benefit from these ongoing wars. So that brings an end to my formal remarks. Those of you who know your cartoons will recognise that term. So I've raised a large number of possible topics that we could talk about. I've given you an overview of what they are, and I've given you a summary view of how classical liberals might understand how these conflicts arise and the different parties involved in these conflicts, and contrasted that with, I'm sure, what you've already read in the papers about the socialist or Marxist accounts of these divisions and conflicts. So perhaps in the Q&A session we can flesh out some of these issues in greater detail. So thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to a good discussion. Thank you.